Last night, I dreamed I was at my own funeral. I've been having this dream almost every night for the last year. It's such a surreal feeling, seeing the people you love mourn losing you. At the same time, it's also kind of nice knowing that these people care so much about my existence. Obviously, having this kind of dream would be mildly unsettling to most, but I see it as an opportunity to know that when things come to an end, people will actually care. As of late, though, there's been a disturbing part of the dream. I keep seeing this person that I don't recognize. He stands among my friends and family, and just seems to loom the entirety of the service. For some reason, I can't place a name to his face, but I can feel that something is off about him. The couple times I've seen him, he always seems to target someone in the crowd and approaches them to console them. He seems so very gentle with them, but when I see his eyes, they seem to have a faint hue, a slight red glow, as he stares at where I lie in my coffin. Now I know most people would just say that it's nothing more than a dream, but I've watched him approach two people in this dream. Both people that he's approached have ended up getting into horrible accidents. One of them passed away. The other will never walk or speak again. I know it's just a dream, but how could it be a coincidence that the two people the man approached in my dream both ended up where they are? There's only so much that you can equate to random chance. Last night, I dreamed I was at my own funeral again, and the man was there. He was there during the entirety of the service, and this time he did something different. He requested to give my eulogy. He stood in front of the entire crowd of people and spoke to them, comforting them and telling them that I was in a better place. This morning, I received a call that my parents and younger sister were hit by a drunk driver. None of them survived. I saw a news report that there was a fire at a local college, in the dorm where a number of my friends stayed. My girlfriend's mother called me this morning to tell me that she had taken her own life the night before. All of them were gone, comforted by his words and lulled into the afterlife. Now, I'm sitting here and waiting my turn. You see, at the end of my dream, after the eulogy, he turned to look at my body in the coffin. He ran a hand through my hair and told me that everything would be okay. His words were comforting, and I felt calm as I watched his glowing red eyes pierce my soul.
Monster. Written and narrated by TeeStache. What is a monster? Is it the fangs, the claws, a tail, the tentacles, scales? Or is it something else? I've been looking for the answer for as long as I can remember. Over the years, I've developed a habit I can't help. I harshly judge people I walk by every day. Sometimes to the point where I might yell everything I didn't like about someone to their face, just because I felt like it. It gets worse though. If I feel I can't stand someone enough, I find a way to kidnap them, drag them to my house, and try to teach them human decency, all before I kill them. My latest target was an elderly man. He had the attitude of someone who couldn't care less how his actions affected anyone around him. Perfect. I followed him for a few weeks, learning his schedule, his habits, looking for the perfect opening. Eventually, I found it. Jim, you see, had an addiction. He tried to bury the heartbreak of losing his wife while he was deployed in Afghanistan. He tried to forget by drinking copious amounts of alcohol, but not enough to die from it. Finally, I walked up to him and asked him if I could buy him a drink for his service. He looked me over and patted his thigh for his wallet, after which he reluctantly agreed. I picked a bar, one that I knew very well. It specialized in crimes of the illegal, but had absolute secrecy. The hostess sat us at a table right next to the bar counter. I ordered a few, I don't remember exactly how many drinks I got. My tolerance was great, and I expected the same for Jim. After a couple hours of drinking and telling stories, his speech began to slur. I ordered him one more drink for the road just to be safe. I helped him out of the bar and slid him into the back of my car. I drove us to my place, making sure to avoid any officers that night. I glanced through the mirror at Jim. He was drinking the bottle as a child would with their food. I finally got home and helped Jim inside. He was confused at not recognizing anything around him. I went to the kitchen, grabbing the meat grinder and walking back to Jim. He made a grunt once it collided with the back of his head. I dropped the tool to the ground, crouched down, picked him up and threw him over my shoulder. I made a mental note of the blood trickling from his head. If I didn't hurry, I feared I wouldn't be able to enjoy this kill. Habit has a way of making things quick. It was minutes by the time he was tied up in the basement. I splashed water on his face to begin. Ugh! What's going on? Who the hell are you? Hello, Jim. I hope you've enjoyed those drinks, because you're stopping right now. I slid on my brass knuckles and began to work on pummeling his face. I spent a couple minutes until I felt disappointed. He wasn't crying out in pain. No tears, no begging. He was silent. I see. You're tougher than I thought. He stared at me, smiling. Henry, why do you do this? His voice sounded smooth, calm, collected. Not the drunken slur, not the raging idiocy. Do what? Henry, how many lives have you taken now? How long ago have you lost your humanity? What the hell? He was covered in bruises and cuts, but he barely reacted to them. I'm still human. He stood up slowly, snapping the rope holding him to the chair. No, you've taken life and death into your own hands. That's not something a human would do. I felt the table behind me, finding the handle of a wooden baseball bat. Get away from me, you freak! I swung as hard as I could. The bat broke in half once it collided with his face. He didn't even register the hit. His voice sounded different this time. I can't do that. You must pay for your sins, Henry. His hand wrapped around my throat, holding me in the air. With the last of my breath, I asked him, What are you? A monster.
The dripping woke him from his afternoon nap. What the hell was that? He said to himself as he rose from the couch. Following the faint tappings of the drips, he walked throughout his home, the sounds becoming louder and louder the closer he came to its source. Eventually, he came to his bathroom, to which the door was closed. He began to panic as he never closed it. and for the last 20 years, he has lived in isolation. Slowly and quietly, he placed his ear to the door, holding his breath so that he might be able to hear better. There was no sound other than the dripping, and various theories began to enter his mind. Perhaps he didn't turn the water off all the way the last time he washed his hands. Maybe he woke up in the middle of his nap to use the bathroom and simply forgot that he absent-mindedly closed the door when he was finished. He was getting old after all. Perhaps his mind wasn't what it used to be. Cautiously, he placed his hand to the doorknob and slowly turned it. The slow and loud creak of the door was agonizing, to the point where he decided to simply push it open. There, behind the door, was nothing. Nothing but an empty bathroom, with no leaking water and not even a sound. Not anymore. Confused, he turned around, scratching his head as he walked back to his couch. That was odd, he said to himself as he sat on the cushion and rubbed his eyes with his arthritic fingers. Maybe I am just getting too old, he sighed. As he removed his fingers from his eyes, his heart nearly stopped at the sight of something straight out of his nightmares. She looked exactly the same as she did the last time he saw her. Well, almost exactly. Her long blonde hair was dripping wet, as though she just emerged from the ocean. Her once tanned skin was now pale as a corpse, and her once green eyes, that he would stare into every night, were as black as the slime that was now oozing from her mouth. He tried to scream as loud as he could, but nothing would come out, and he closed his eyes, waiting to be taken by the specter before him. But nothing happened. Opening one eye, he saw that there was no one there. He opened the other, rubbed them both some more, and looked again. Did he just see the undead visage of the woman he once loved? Had she come back to haunt him, or was his aging mind really playing tricks on him? The rest of the day went on as usual, and no more did he see any terrifying visions from a long-dead infatuation. Later that night, however, his nightmares would once again manifest. It was a little after midnight when he opened his eyes, and to his horror, he could not move, not even a finger. His heart began to race as panic struck him. But he would not know true terror, however, until he realized the intense pressure on his chest was there for a reason. He could feel cold, wet hands grab him by the head and lift it slightly. There in front of him, sitting on his chest, was her. Her deep black eyes stared into his eyes, and she slowly opened her mouth. She pulled his head closer to hers and placed her cold, soggy lips to his own. He could do nothing but moan and gargle as he could feel and taste cold, rancid water being purged down his throat. Black liquid seeped from their lips as his eyes rolled into the back of his head. Eventually, his moans and gargles ceased as he was released. He would never awaken. It would be weeks before his corpse would be found. Only when his daughter, who had become worried after hearing nothing from him, notified the police for a welfare check, would he finally be found. He laid there, a look of horror frozen on his face, but no traces of any water or any indications that he had been drowned by the undead spirit of a woman he had loved for years. Eventually, however, a horrifying truth would be unearthed as his home was investigated. In his basement, locked away from the rest of the world, was a large drum. Inside that drum, which had been filled with water, were the remains of a woman that had been reported missing more than 20 years ago. Her official cause of death was that of drowning.
The Ride by Reddit user AlexHicks19. The railway line was always down whenever they traveled. It just seemed to happen. Disruptions that required them to wait for hours on end for the service to resume. Or if they were lucky, until a bus service took the place of the dilapidated trains. Today was no different. They sat together near the back of the bus as it trudged along through the night. She lay her head on him, tired and annoyed at the incessant misfortune they always had when traveling. He stared out the window, daydreaming with his headphones in. His thoughts fluttered and passed, none sufficient enough to harbor for more than a minute. The dim lights in the cabin caused his reflection to stare back at him. The bus was full, as one would expect due to problems with the train, and yet it was oddly silent. His bag between his legs, he continued to stare vacantly out the window. Something sped past the bus. It caused him to jolt out of his semi-conscious state. He looked around the bus at the other passengers. No one had seen or noticed anything. It was dark outside. Maybe he had dozed off and had a dream. As they drove through Winchester, he laughed at the way the fog gathered around the old lampposts. As a horror fanatic, it dawned on him that the fog and antique lampposts were eerily similar to those you would imagine when Jack the Ripper walked the streets of Whitechapel. Would he be lucky enough to catch a glimpse of an ominous figure skulking in the fog? One could always hope. He glanced over at his travel companion. He smiled at her as she slept. She shifted in her sleep, and he slouched slightly so she could position her head better on his shoulder. He shifted his head back to the window and met the gaze of something that was moving on par with the bus and was now looking into the vehicle. Shocked, he stood up, causing Delilah to wake. She looked up at him in a daze, and he babbled to her about what he saw. They both turned to the now empty window, and he sat down confused. He was sure he had seen something, and something had seen him. He looked out at where they were, hoping to see the name of the town they were passing through, but all he could see was thick masses of trees outside the window. The bus began to slow down. He could see the other passengers look around in confusion. William stood up and looked towards the front of the bus to try and see why they were stopping. Outside, the night was still and dark, and it moved towards them. A tree had fallen across the road, and considering they were driving through a woodland, it was hardly a shock. The bus driver turned the lights in the cabin on, and the loudspeaker began to crackle. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry to inform you, but unfortunately our trip has been delayed due to a tree obstructing our path. Woodland Services has been contacted, and we can expect to be moving within the next hour or so. Your patience is appreciated. Thank you. The loudspeaker went dead again. Murmurs rose throughout the bus as people grew agitated. A few individuals stood by their seats while some began pacing the length of the bus. William looked out the window yet again and caught but a glimpse of it. The hairs on his arms stood up as his heart began to race. Nobody knew what it was. All they knew was that the bus driver was now dead. His body lay dissected and spread over the tree that blocked their way. They didn't even see it place him there. The body had simply fallen from the top of the bus. He had stepped outside to have a smoke, and all everybody could hear were his screams. One brave gentleman had rushed off the bus to help, but returned immediately, pushing the button to close the doors behind him. He sat on the floor by his seat, shaking violently. People crowded him and asked what he had seen, but he simply sat there shaking his head. Shortly after that, the body hit the tree, intestines draped over the wood, with blood painting a grotesque picture on the road. His body had been ripped apart and put on display for everyone to see, arms and legs separated from the torso, stomach slashed open from end to end. Everybody crowded at the front of the bus and looked on in shock. Prayers were heard throughout the bus as footsteps thumped heavily above them. Nobody moved. Everybody was too scared to move. Delilah gripped William's shirt and cried. He held her. For a while, nothing more happened. Whatever it was had stopped walking on the bus. People began to discuss what to do. The consensus reached was it must have been a wolf or a bear, maybe both. But whatever it was, they were almost certain it had left them now. The man who first stepped off the bus, Jerry, finally stood up. "It's not a wolf," he said, "nor is it a bear." The crowd quieted down and gave their joint attention to him. "Whatever the hell it isn't anything anyone has ever seen," he told them. "I knew what it was doing while it ate him. I saw it in its eyes. It's waiting and watching us. It has a plan." Panic set in as people did not know what to do. Some wanted to leave and try to run towards town, but if it was still out there, that would be a death sentence. William saw how fast it moved. It would catch and kill them all. Cell phones were of no use. They were surrounded by shrubbery and trees. Finally, Gary, a fellow passenger, suggested they try and radio in the situation to get help. The crowd agreed with him, and he walked tentatively towards the driver's cockpit. He opened the door that stood between the passengers and the driver and sat in the dead man's seat. He picked up the radio that sat on the dashboard. He pushed the button as he spoke. The window immediately to his right shattered. People screamed, and before anyone could react, Gary was pulled, screaming, out into the darkness. His body followed the example of the driver and ended up in bloody pieces spread out over the tree. They were all going to die. William knew that now. People sat huddled together, hoping that being in a group would protect them. With the speed and ferocity that it moved, nothing would protect them. They could but hope that death would be swift and quick. William continued to hold Delilah as she cried. He didn't console her or tell her everything would be okay. Things definitely would not be okay. The bus engine had been left on, the lights from it illuminating the mess of bodies set in front of them on display. However, the battery had been left on for too long without the engine running. The lights dimmed and flickered before giving up. They sat now, in darkness. The people's cries grew with the increased fear that came with darkness. The doors to the bus shook and creaked. Silence prevailed in the bus as shock descended on the masses. With a loud shriek, it came crashing through the bus door. It was not from this earth. "The next stop is Portchester," the bus driver shouted over the loudspeaker. "This is our stop. Come on, wake up. Let's go." Delilah shook him gently. Almost screaming, William woke up from his slumber. He never seemed to be able to stay awake on bus rides. He had goosebumps when he woke up. Man, had that felt real. He had to tell Delilah about it. She'd probably just chalk it down to the nonsense movies and books he enjoyed. He picked up his bag and cast one more look out the window. Fog had just begun to roll around the bus yet again.